The silence between them. There was something about silence that told more truth than words ever could. It was late September in Los Angeles, the kind of evening where the light melted softly through the skyline like butter over warm toast. The city glowed, but in a hush, like it was holding its breath. Somewhere behind the closed doors of a small, ivy-wrapped home in the Hollywood Hills, Sandra Bullock stood barefoot on the balcony, clutching a chipped white mug of lukewarm coffee. Her eyes weren't looking at the view. They were searching for something far more elusive. A memory, a feeling, a name. Keanu. It had been 3 years since they'd last spoken. Not because of some dramatic fallout. No tabloids. No slammed doors. Just the slow, aching erosion of connection. The way time wears down even the strongest things if left untouched. Work, schedules, press, distance, a million little reasons that all sounded reasonable until you realized they had built a canyon between two people who once laughed until dawn over Chinese takeout and wine. Sandra missed him, more than she dared admit to anyone, even herself. The last time she had seen him was at a private screening, one of those hush-hush events that celebrities pretend not to enjoy. She had worn her hair up. He had worn all black, looking like time hadn't dared touch him. They'd hugged, smiled politely, exchanged the standard, "we should catch up soon" promises, then walked away in opposite directions, hearts dragging behind like forgotten luggage. Tonight, the silence was too loud, and that's when she did something unexpected. She picked up her phone. No script, no media assistant, no manager. Just her fingers trembling slightly as she typed a message she had deleted and retyped at least 10 times. "Are you around? I think I need a friend tonight." She stared at the screen, watched the little typing dots dance, then disappear. For a moment, nothing. Then, "Where are you?" Her breath caught. Keanu Reeves had never been one to rush. His life was like jazz, carefully improvised, deeply felt. He wasn't about theatrics or grand entrances. But when Sandra said she needed him, he didn't hesitate. Within the hour, a vintage black motorcycle hummed gently to a stop at the edge of her driveway. The moment she opened the door, it was like the past years fell off her shoulders. He hadn't changed. The same kind, quiet eyes, the same understated warmth. Yet something was different too. Deeper. As if life had pressed fingerprints into his soul since they last spoke, and in her eyes he saw the same. Neither of them spoke at first. He stepped inside, and she wordlessly handed him the mug she'd been holding. He took a sip, made a face. "Cold? I forgot I even made it," she said almost apologetically. "That's okay. Some things are better when they've sat with time," he replied softly. She looked at him then, really looked, and smiled. The living room had always been cozy. Wooden floors, faded rugs, soft throws, and a wall of books that threatened to spill emotion if touched. They sat on the couch like old friends trying to remember the rhythm of a song they once danced to. "You look tired," he said gently. "I've been holding a lot in," she admitted, wrapping a blanket tighter around her legs. He nodded. The world expects too much from those who smile well. That line broke something. She laughed, then covered her face with both hands. "God, I've missed talking like this." "I've missed you, Sandy." Her hands fell slowly from her face. The nickname. No one called her that anymore. "I didn't think you still did," she whispered. "I always did. I just got used to pretending I didn't." For the next few hours they talked, not about red carpets or cameras, but about life. About how she felt invisible some days. About how he sometimes walked through a crowd and still felt alone. About the roles they played, on screen and in real life, and the truth that often got buried beneath applause. They spoke of her father's passing, of his sister's health battles, of how fame didn't save them from real pain, of how kindness, real kindness, had become so rare in a world obsessed with optics. And somewhere between the soft confession and the quiet nods, a kind of healing began. But it wasn't until the clock crept past midnight and the fireplace crackled with a hush that she said the words that changed everything. She didn't plan it, didn't rehearse. It came out like a breath she'd been holding since the day they drifted apart. "Keanu, I loved you. I just never had the courage to live like it." The room fell still. He looked at her, not like a man startled, but like a man who had waited years to hear what his heart already knew. He didn't speak right away, just reached out slowly and held her hand, thumb tracing the inside of her palm like it was something sacred. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I always knew. I just didn't want to make you choose." Her eyes filled. "That's the thing," she said, voice shaking. "I never had to choose. I just had to stop running." That night they didn't fall into some dramatic embrace. No movie-style kiss. No soaring music. They just sat there, hands intertwined, silence holding them like an old friend. It was the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but full of everything they never said, everything they were finally ready to say. Outside, the moon hung heavy over the hills. Inside, for the first time in years, two souls rested, not as actors, not as stars, just as Sandra and Keanu. The truth between the lines. The next morning arrived without permission, sneaking in through the drawn curtains like a hesitant guest. The sunlight didn't shout its way into the room, it whispered, tracing soft gold across the wooden floor, illuminating the quiet space where two lives were still trying to understand what had just shifted between them. Sandra had fallen asleep, curled into one corner of the couch, still wrapped in the soft gray blanket, her head tilted slightly to the side, her features softened by rest. Keanu, not wanting to wake her, sat in the armchair just a few feet away, watching her sleep with an expression caught somewhere between admiration and heartbreak. It wasn't that he hadn't known how she felt. Keanu had always read people like music, between the lyrics, beneath the melody, in the silence between chords. And Sandra, for all her warmth and laughter and magnetic presence, had always been playing a song only few could hear. He had sensed it back when they were younger, on sets, on press tours, in quiet elevator rides after long days of pretending to be other people. But they had both been so careful, so endlessly polite, so tragically professional. No lines crossed, no risks taken, because they were afraid of what would happen if the truth finally took up space between them. And now it had. She stirred slowly, her lashes fluttering as her breath deepened and her senses returned. The moment she saw him still there, her entire body relaxed into a smile that didn't need words. "You stayed," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded gently. "I wasn't ready to leave. There was no rush to move, no urgency in their rhythm. They were beyond that now. For once, they weren't running from time. They were sitting with it, letting it breathe." Over breakfast, which was nothing more than burned toast and coffee that actually stayed hot this time, Sandra told him about the letter. A letter she had written 2 years ago but never sent. A letter to him. "I wrote it after that last screening," she said, folding her legs beneath her on the bench outside the kitchen. "I got home that night and just couldn't sleep. I wrote for hours, and when I finished I folded it and put it in the drawer, and every few months I'd find it again, reread it, cry a little, then put it back. Why didn't you send it?" he asked. She looked away. "Because I was afraid it was too late. Or that maybe I'd imagined it all. That maybe what I felt wasn't mutual. And I couldn't bear losing you in real life after already losing you in the silence." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back, his hands wrapped around his mug, eyes distant but focused. "You never lost me, Sandy. I was just stuck, caught between wanting more and not wanting to break what we had." She nodded slowly, her gaze still distant. "We both were." There was a pause. Then she reached into the drawer by the hallway and returned with an envelope, yellowing slightly at the edges. She slid it toward him. "Read it, if you want. But not here. Not now. Later, when you're ready." He looked at the envelope like it contained a universe. And maybe it did. That afternoon, they took a walk. Not through glamorous Beverly Hills or paparazzi-filled streets, but down a quiet nature trail just outside the city, where the air was clean and the trees didn't care who they were. It was during that walk that Keanu spoke of his solitude. Not loneliness, he never saw himself as lonely, but of the ache that came from constantly being seen, yet never really known. Fame, he said, had a way of amplifying your reflection while muffling your soul. Sandra understood, better than most. She shared stories of hotel rooms that felt like cages, of smiling through interviews while grieving privately, of fans who praised her strength while she fell apart behind closed doors. And Keanu, always gentle, always listening, never interrupted. He let her pour it out, never asking her to stop or explain. He just held space for it, and in doing so, she felt lighter. They stopped at a small bench carved into the hillside, overlooking the valley below. The view was vast, the city in the distance, barely audible. Keanu pulled out the envelope she had given him earlier. He hadn't opened it yet. "Do you want me to read it now?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, not here. I don't want to watch you read my heart like a script." He smiled. Fair. A gust of wind swept past them, playing with the ends of her hair. For a moment, she leaned against his shoulder and he didn't move, didn't flinch. Just let her stay there, warm and unburdened. That night, after walking her home and promising to meet again the next morning, Keanu sat on the edge of his bed in his quiet apartment and opened the letter. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. The words were raw, honest, a confession of missed chances and quiet longing, of sleepless nights wondering what could have been, of gratitude for his presence in her life, even if just as a friend. And in one sentence, near the end, written in slightly shakier ink, she had written, "If I ever find the courage to say this to you in person, it will mean I'm finally ready to stop hiding from the truth of who I am and who I've always loved." Keanu closed his eyes. The room was still, but his heart wasn't. He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, he returned to her house early, earlier than he should have. He had barely knocked before the door opened, and there she was, dressed in an oversized sweater, no makeup, hair still messy from sleep. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him like she already knew. "You read it," she whispered. He nodded. "And?" He took a slow breath. "And I'm still here." Her eyes brimmed instantly. He stepped closer. "I don't want to be your what if, Sandra. I don't want to wonder anymore. We've lost enough time." She laughed through tears. "We have no idea how to do this." "We don't need to," he said. "We just need to start." And just like that, a chapter they had both left unread began to unfold, not with fireworks or sweeping music, but with quiet trust, shared glances, and a promise spoken not in vows, but in presence. The weight of almost. For the first time in years, the days began to slow down, not because the world around them changed, but because they were no longer rushing past the things that mattered. Sandra and Keanu didn't leap into something with fireworks or declarations. Instead, they moved like two rivers converging, gently, unforced, finding new flow in the spaces where they once stood still. They met each morning, sometimes without a plan. Breakfasts became walks. Walks became quiet conversations. And silence, that once heavy silence, became their softest language. There was a moment, just after a grocery run of all things, that settled something inside Sandra. They had chosen the most ordinary day to be utterly vulnerable. She had forgotten her wallet, flustered in the checkout line, fumbling with apples and almond milk when Keanu, without words, had simply stepped forward, paid, and looked at her like it didn't matter. It wasn't the gesture. It was how familiar it felt. How easy it was to accept help when it came without weight or expectation. In that single moment, she understood what it meant to be seen. Not as a celebrity. Not as a woman admired from afar. Not even as someone admired for her strength. But as a human being worth showing up for in the small ways. That night, as they sat on her back porch with the city twinkling in the distance, she told him something she had never admitted to anyone. "I don't know who I am when I'm not being strong," she said, staring at the stars instead of him. "When I'm not performing resilience or holding people together, I've spent so many years holding the walls up around me that I've forgotten what it feels like to be soft." Keanu didn't rush to respond. He rarely did. He gave her words room to echo, to breathe. Finally, he said, "You don't have to be soft with the whole world, just with the people who earn it." "And have you?" she asked, turning to face him. His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered with all the years of watching her from a distance. "I never stopped trying." She smiled, but it trembled. "Then don't stop now." They didn't touch. They didn't need to. What passed between them was more sacred than physical intimacy. It was the opening of emotional doors long kept locked, the crumbling of decades of performance in favor of something real. In the weeks that followed, they created a rhythm not of lovers in haste, but of friends rediscovering the language of trust. They cooked together, Sandra chopping too aggressively, Keanu insisting on measuring everything with surgical calm. They argued gently about movies, teased each other about bad takes, rewatched old scenes they once acted together but now saw through the eyes of who they'd become. They laughed more than they cried, but when tears came, they were never hidden. It wasn't a perfect story. Some days were quieter than others. Some days they avoided the truth. The past still lingered like dust in corners, relationships they never fully recovered from, regrets they hadn't yet voiced, fears of what love would demand of them if they let it grow again. But amidst all of that was a kind of unspoken agreement, to let the truth bloom slowly, to not tear it from the ground just to see if it had roots. And then came the night that changed everything, not because of some dramatic revelation, but because of one shared moment of vulnerability neither of them could unsee. They had attended a small charity event together, nothing extravagant. Keanu had been invited to present an award. Sandra was there simply to support. But the moment they walked in together, the room shifted. Cameras didn't flash because it was a closed event, but the glances, the whispers, the old energy of a public hungry for a story filled the air like static. Sandra had felt it instantly, that old panic rise in her chest, the feeling of being watched, dissected, of her life becoming someone else's narrative again. She had spent years mastering the art of smiling through discomfort, of dazzling her way through scrutiny. But as she stood in that glittering room beside the man who knew her without any of that armor, she couldn't pretend, and Keanu saw it. He leaned down and whispered, "We can leave." She shook her head, forcing a smile. "No, it's fine." He didn't press. He just stayed close, close enough that his presence became her shield. Later, in the car, she didn't cry. She didn't collapse. But she looked at him with eyes that had seen too much for too long. "I'm tired, Keanu," she said, her voice like gravel, "of being something for everyone else, of never belonging fully to anyone." He didn't answer with comfort. He answered with a truth of his own. "I've belonged to you longer than I understood. But I was always afraid you'd never let yourself have me." Her breath caught, not because it was new, but because it was the first time he'd said it out loud. "I didn't think I was allowed," she confessed. "I didn't think I was enough." "Enough?" he echoed, shaking his head. "Sandra, you've always been enough. More than enough. You just kept giving yourself away to people who couldn't see it. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed, but not in the way tabloids would twist. He stayed because she needed someone to hold space, not her body. He stayed on the couch again, quietly listening to the rhythm of her house, the soft creaks of wood, the wind against the windows, the breathing of someone finally letting herself exhale, and for the first time in years, she slept through the night. The next morning, she woke to the smell of something burning. Again. Keanu was in the kitchen, trying and failing to flip pancakes. He looked up guiltily as she entered. "I was trying to impress you," he said with mock solemnity. Sandra grinned. "You impressed me just by showing up." He tilted his head. "I've always shown up. You just never opened the door." She stopped. Not because the words hurt, but because they were true. And the truth, when spoken gently, has a way of softening the hardest things inside us. "I'm opening it now," she said. He smiled. "Then let's keep walking through it." In those days, something new began to take root. Not the kind of romance people write about in magazines, not the kind of headline that sparks a Twitter frenzy, but something quieter, more profound. A companionship forged not by infatuation but by knowing, by surviving life's lonely stretches separately and now choosing to navigate what came next together. They were not teenagers chasing butterflies. They were grown souls choosing peace over performance, kindness over chaos, truth over fairy tales, and in that choice, they found a kind of love that didn't demand declarations, but offered sanctuary. The world didn't know yet. The cameras hadn't seen, but within the walls of that modest home in the Hollywood Hills, a new story was being written. Not one crafted for screenplays or interviews, but one that belonged only to them. And in the stillness of the night, when the world went quiet, Sandra sometimes whispered it to herself like a promise. I'm not afraid to love him anymore. And Keanu, miles away in his apartment, reading old poetry under a dim lamp, would smile at a line in his book, unaware she had spoken those words, but feeling them, just the same, 'cause some love stories don't need to be told, they just need to be lived. The ghosts we carry. Some truths don't arrive as revelations. They unfold, slowly, insistently, like light creeping through the cracks in a room that's been locked too long. And for Sandra, the days spent beside Keanu weren't about discovering something new. They were about finally seeing what had always been there, not just in him, but in herself. It was a Tuesday when it all began to unravel again, not in a dramatic spiral, but in the quiet, unsettling way that old pain resurfaces when you least expect it. The two of them had taken a short trip up the coast, just a weekend escape to a small beachside cabin that didn't know or care who they were. No cameras, no handlers. Just ocean, wind, and the sound of waves speaking in rhythms older than sorrow. They had spent the day laughing. Keanu had tried teaching her how to skip stones, and she had mockingly declared war after her first 4 skips left his best at 2. They had eaten fish tacos from a food truck and danced barefoot in the sand, letting the sun paint warmth into their skin. For the first time in years, she felt ageless, free of industry, of identity, of all the weight that clung to her name. But it was that night, when the fire crackled and the laughter faded into something gentler, that the ghosts returned. She sat beside him on the deck, knees hugged to her chest, sweater pulled tight against the night breeze. The stars above blinked like memories. Keanu was quiet, his arm lightly resting on the back of her chair, not touching, but close enough to remind her he was still there, still listening. I never told you what happened the night my mother died, she said suddenly, her voice caught somewhere between past and present. We weren't speaking. Not because we were fighting, but because I was busy. Always busy. Always somewhere else. She had called a few days before, said she was tired. I thought she meant emotionally. I didn't hear what she was really saying. Keanu turned toward her, his eyes softening. She passed in her sleep. Alone. In her little house in Virginia. I didn't even make it to the funeral. The press found out before I did. By the time I landed, the world had already moved on. But I didn't. A part of me froze right there, in that moment. And I think I never unfroze. He didn't speak. Didn't offer comfort or cliches. Just waited. She exhaled slowly. I've built a life on being present for the world. For roles. For cameras. But I couldn't be present for her. And somewhere along the way, I started believing I didn't deserve to be present for anyone else. Especially not someone like you. Keanu leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. I get it, he said quietly. My best friend died when I was 23. A motorcycle accident. We'd had dinner the night before, argued over something stupid, sports, I think. And I never got to take it back. Never got to say, you mattered to me. That guilt, it follows you. But Sandra, grief doesn't make you unworthy. It makes you human. She turned to him, her eyes searching. And if I never let it go, then let me help carry it. They sat there for a long time. Two people who had lived in the public eye and still managed to be invisible to themselves. And as the fire burned lower, something unspoken settled into the space between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but permission. Permission to begin healing without needing to justify every scar. When they returned to Los Angeles, the city felt different. It hadn't changed, of course. It still buzzed with pretense, still flashed and filtered and shouted, but something inside Sandra had softened. She no longer felt like she had to earn every breath she took. She no longer felt like loving someone meant she had to prove her worth every morning. And Keanu, in his quiet way, never demanded anything from her. He simply stayed, unmoving, present, like the steady hum of something finally true. But not everyone in their lives shared that quiet understanding. It was at a small industry dinner, a favor for a producer friend, that the first crack appeared. They hadn't announced anything, hadn't posted or walked any red carpets together. But when Keanu placed his hand lightly on the small of Sandra's back while guiding her through the crowded room, eyes turned, whispers sparked, and within 24 hours the tabloids had written their story for them. Reeves and Bullock back on? Insiders say it's more than just friendship. She had expected it. She'd been here before, but the weight of it hit differently now. Not because she cared what the world thought, but because she didn't want what they were building to be reduced to a headline. She didn't want their private grace to become public currency. She paced her living room the next morning, phone buzzing every 10 seconds with inquiries, sources, photo requests, press handlers eager to spin something out of nothing. "I can't do this again," she muttered, running her hand through her hair. Keanu sat quietly on the couch watching her. "Then don't," she turned. "You don't get it. They'll twist it. They'll start tearing into every detail, comparing us to the people we were 20 years ago, dredging up past partners. They'll try to own our story before we even finish writing it." He stood, walked to her, placed his hands on her shoulders gently. "Then let's not give them the pen." "But how?" "By living it. Not defending it. Not hiding it. Not explaining it. Just living it." She stared at him, the storm inside her still spinning. He cupped her face softly. "Let them talk. Let them speculate. What we have, what we're growing, isn't for them. It's for us. And we don't owe anyone a performance." Her eyes closed. And when they opened, there was still fear. But behind it, something steadier. Trust. "I'm not used to being loved quietly," she said. He smiled. "Then let's change that." Later that week they did something bold. Not by Hollywood standards, but by their own. They went for a walk in public. No disguises. No running from paparazzi. They walked down Sunset Boulevard, stopped for ice cream, sat on a bench like two people who had nothing to hide. And when someone asked for a photo, Keanu gently declined. "Just enjoying a day with someone I care about," he said. No dramatics, no denial. Just truth. The photo still made it online. Of course it did, but the caption was simple. Keanu and Sandra. Still just them. And for once, the world seemed to respect that. That night, in the quiet after dinner, Sandra pulled a box from her closet. Inside were old journals, letters, photos, pieces of a life she'd archived in fragments. She handed them to Keanu. "If we're going to do this," she said, "you should know all the pieces. Even the messy ones." He didn't open them right away. Just placed the box on the table and looked her in the eyes. "I don't need to read your past to love your present," he said. "But if sharing it brings you peace, I'll carry every word." She laughed softly, tearfully. "You keep offering to carry me." "Not carry," he said. "Walk beside." And that was the moment Sandra finally let go. Not of grief, not of guilt, not of the woman she used to be, but of the belief that love had to be hard to be real. That vulnerability was weakness. That silence meant abandonment, because Keanu had rewritten those truths not with promises, but with presence. A voice in the silence. Time had a peculiar way of folding in on itself. Days with Keanu no longer felt measured in hours, but in the still moments between laughter and breath, the unspoken understanding that filled a room without a word. Sandra had once believed that love was found in grand gestures, roses on red carpets, confessions under spotlights. But now she saw it in quiet things, in how he placed a second cup of coffee next to hers before she even woke, in the way he remembered the names of her dogs, even the ones she lost years ago, in how he waited, not because he was patient, but because he knew healing didn't happen on demand. Still, even peace has its ghosts. They were preparing for a small interview, one Sandra had agreed to weeks ago, a feature piece for a legacy magazine reflecting on her career, her life, her milestones. Keanu wouldn't be in it, at least not directly. It wasn't about them. But in the age of subtle nods and careful wording, the world would read between the lines anyway. That morning, as she sat by her vanity, brushing her hair back with slow, deliberate strokes, she stared at her reflection and saw not just herself, but all the versions she had been. The young woman chasing scripts, the grieving daughter, the flawless actress they said never cracked, the woman who cracked in silence, alone, and now this strange, beautiful woman she was becoming, a woman who had learned to let someone stay. When Keanu appeared in the doorway, dressed in black with a book under his arm, she smiled at him through the mirror. "You look like someone who knows something the world hasn't figured out yet," she teased. He stepped closer, held the book up. "Just reading Neruda," he said, and thinking about how every poem he wrote felt like it was searching for someone. She paused. "Did you find me in it?" "No," he said, smiling faintly. "I found pieces of you in between the lines. That's how I know it's real." Later that day, the interview began with the usual warmth and ease. The journalist was kind, respectful, deeply prepared. They spoke of legacy, of career shifts, of projects that meant more than money. But it was when the conversation turned to change that Sandra's voice grew quieter. "What's different now, Sandra?" the interviewer asked gently. "You've always been poised, thoughtful. But lately you seem softer, more still. There's something quieter in your presence." Sandra hesitated, unsure how much to say. But then she remembered the promise she made to herself, to stop editing her truth for comfort. "I've stopped hiding," she said simply. "For most of my life I was always performing, even off camera. Performing strength, performing happiness, performing independence, and it worked, for a while. But performing isn't the same as living. Now, I want to live." The journalist tilted her head, curious. "Was there a moment that shifted that for you?" Sandra's eyes flickered toward the closed door behind which Keanu was reading quietly, completely unaware that he had just become the most significant sentence of her life. "There wasn't a moment," she replied. "There was a person. That night when she told Keanu what she'd said, he didn't react with surprise or modesty. He just closed the book he had been reading, set it down, and looked at her the way someone does when they've been waiting for the right moment to speak. "I was thinking about something," he said softly. "Do you remember that film festival in Berlin? The one where we sat by the river at 2 a.m. because we couldn't sleep?" She nodded slowly. "We talked about everything and nothing. I remember you asked me if I believed in soulmates." Sandra blinked, surprised. "I did," he nodded. "You said it like a joke, but I could tell it wasn't. I told you I didn't know if I believed in the one, but that maybe some people just feel like home, and did I?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He just leaned forward, his voice low and unshakable. "You still do, but love, especially the kind born from decades of waiting, rarely arrives without tests." A few days later, an unexpected letter arrived at Sandra's doorstep. Not an email, not a message through agents. A real, handwritten letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her ex-husband. She sat with it for hours, unopened. It felt heavy, not just in weight but in the way old wounds do when someone knocks on them years later. When she finally read it, it wasn't malicious. It wasn't pleading. It was apologetic. Honest. A letter from a man who had broken something fragile and now, in hindsight, saw what it had cost. She didn't cry. Not immediately. But later that evening, after Keanu had gone home, she sat on the floor of her living room and wept. Not because she missed the man, but because for the first time, she saw herself clearly in that past. A woman who had chosen silence over confrontation, performance over truth. A woman who had accepted less than she deserved because she believed her broken pieces made her unworthy of being fully held. Keanu returned the next morning. She hadn't told him. Didn't plan to. But he saw it. The weight in her body. The tremble in her hands as she poured coffee. And in that unspoken way he always had, he reached out and placed his hand gently on hers. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "But you don't have to carry it alone either." That broke her, not in pain. But in release, she handed him the letter. Let him read it. Let him sit with the history she had once kept locked behind glass. And when he looked up, there was no jealousy in his eyes. No insecurity, just love. Love rooted in the present. Love that said, "You are not your past." Sandra didn't speak for a long time, but when she did, her voice was clear. "I never let myself grieve the girl I was. The girl who stayed silent. The woman who smiled through betrayal. I buried her under red carpets and interviews and awards." Keanu held her hand tighter. "Then let's bring her home." They began attending therapy together. Not because they were broken, but because they were building something sacred, and sacred things deserve care. They didn't speak of labels, didn't announce anything to the world. They focused inward, on healing, on patterns, on truths that weren't always pretty but always necessary. In one session, Sandra finally said it out loud. "I was always afraid that if someone saw all of me, the ugly, the tired, the angry, the grieving, they'd leave." The therapist had asked gently, "And did he?" Sandra looked at Keanu then, her eyes full of all the storms he had stood through. "No," she said. He stayed. Later that week they returned to that beach cabin. This time, not to escape, but to honor something. They sat by the fire again. And this time, Sandra brought something of her own. A small box of old photos, letters, fragments of her life she had never shown anyone. She placed them on the table between them. "This is all of me," she said. "Every crack, every shadow, every version I thought would make me unlovable." Keanu looked at the box, then at her. "I never needed a perfect version of you," he said. "I just needed the real one." She reached across the table, took his hand. "Then here I am." And for the first time in her life, she meant it fully. What she whispered. The world hadn't changed, not really. The cameras still followed, the headlines still speculated, and strangers still felt entitled to the intimate details of Sandra's life. But inside her, something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the click of a door unlocking, like a long-held breath finally released. For the first time in decades, Sandra wasn't running from herself. She wasn't performing the role of America's sweetheart, or strong woman, or flawless icon. She was simply being. And next to her, always at a quiet, steady pace, Keanu walked not in front of her, not behind her, but with her. In the months following their return from the beach house, life began to reshape itself around their quiet revolution. They weren't interested in making announcements. They didn't craft press statements or post filtered photos with hearts and captions. They weren't building a love story for the world. They were building one for each other. And the more, they chose privacy over publicity, the more the relationship became sacred. Friends began to notice a difference in her, not just in how she looked, but in how she moved, how her laughter now came from her belly instead of her cheekbones, how her eyes lingered longer when listening, how she no longer interrupted herself to meet someone else's comfort. One evening, after a quiet dinner and a walk through Laurel Canyon, Keanu looked over at her and said something simple but shattering in its truth. "You're not holding your breath anymore." Sandra paused, surprised by how true that was. "Because I finally feel safe," she said. "With you, with myself, with the silence." They sat on a bench beneath a canopy of eucalyptus trees. The air was thick with the scent of wild earth and soft leaves. The city below them glittered like a stage they had both chosen to step away from. He reached for her hand, fingers tracing the inside of her palm the same way he had the night she told him she loved him. Quietly, without drama, without demand. "I used to think love was about saving someone," Keanu said. "But now, I think, real love is about being there when they choose to save themselves." She turned toward him. "Then, thank you for waiting." "I didn't wait," he said, eyes warm. "I lived. I grew. And when you came back, I was ready to meet you where you were." A few days later, they were invited to a private award ceremony. Nothing extravagant, just an intimate gathering honoring longtime careers in film and contribution to the industry. It was the kind of event where legends were quietly recognized, not paraded. Keanu had insisted they attend, not for the spotlight, but because for once it wasn't about being seen. It was about honoring the journey. Sandra was to be presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award. As she stood backstage, clutching her small note card of remarks, her heart raced, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew that this time she wouldn't be speaking to strangers. She would be speaking to herself, to the girl who began acting at 21, hungry and uncertain, to the woman who wore heels and a smile to survive press junkets while grieving the loss of her mother, to the soul who had loved silently, left silently, and returned bravely. Keanu stood beside her, not offering advice or strategy, just presence. And when the time came for her to walk on stage, he didn't kiss her. He didn't hug her. He just looked into her eyes and said, "You don't need the words. You are the story." Her hands stopped shaking. She stepped out onto the small stage, the audience rising not out of formality, but out of respect. The applause was thunderous, but her voice, when she began to speak, was gentle. "I've spent most of my life chasing the idea of who I thought I needed to be. For studios, for fans, for family. And in doing so, I forgot who I was when the lights were off, when the makeup was gone, when the house was quiet. But over the past year, I've started to remember. I've started to come home to the version of myself that doesn't need to be perfect, just present." She looked down at the card in her hand, then back up at the room. "I had a whole speech, written, but there's something I want to say that I've never said publicly, something that changed my life." Her eyes locked with Keanu's, who stood just beyond the lights, barely visible, but fully felt. "I was afraid to love him," she said. "Afraid that if I let him in, he'd see the mess I've spent my whole life hiding. But instead, he saw the beauty in it. He didn't save me. He sat with me. He didn't fix me. He waited for me to stop pretending I was broken." There was silence, not awkward, but reverent. And one night I whispered something to him, something I had never said out loud. And his response didn't change my life because of what he said. It changed my life because he stayed after hearing it. She smiled, a single tear tracing her cheek. And that's what love is. Not the words, not the gestures, but the decision to stay with someone who is still becoming. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was long, sustained, as if everyone in that room recognized that she hadn't just spoken a truth, she had dismantled a myth. Later that night, as they sat in the back of the car heading home, she leaned her head against his shoulder. The air smelled faintly of roses and rain. He rested his hand over hers. "You never told me," he said after a while, "what exactly it was that you whispered that night, the thing that left me speechless." She chuckled softly. "Are you sure you want to know now?" "I think I already know," he said, "but I want to hear it anyway." She turned, looked him in the eyes, the city's soft glow reflecting off the glass. I whispered, "I'm terrified, because you feel like home, and I've never trusted myself to stay anywhere for long." Keanu's breath caught, not because the words were new, but because hearing them out loud felt like finishing a song he had only ever hummed in pieces. "And now?" he asked. She smiled. "Now, I know home isn't a place you stay in. It's a person you choose to walk with, one day at a time, one truth at a time." He didn't say anything more. He just kissed the top of her head and pulled her a little closer. And in the silence that followed, there were no more ghosts, just two people, still becoming, still staying.